Well, thank you very much, Özlem, and to the other organizers of this conference for inviting me. For years, I've been hearing about what a great conference this is, and I'm delighted to finally be able to come and see that that's really true. I've been learning so much from all the presentations I've been able to attend, and it's a real honor to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about restructuring finance to promote productive employment. There you go. And I've been doing this work with many colleagues and graduate students who've worked as co-authors and research assistants. And I want to thank the Institute for New Economic Thinking also for financial support. So the questions to be addressed, that I'm hoping to try to address tonight, how does finance affect the real economy in general? And since this conference is focused on employment, that's what I'm going to try to focus on as well. And how should finance be restructured to promote socially productive and especially sustainable employment in this globally warming world that we now inhabit? There's one simple answer to the first question: how does finance affect the real economy? According to Andrew Haldane of the Bank of England, the cost of the current crisis, which was caused, at least in the first instance, by the financial sector. The cost of the current crisis, when you add up all the foregone output over the future that we can imagine, is somewhere in the range of $60 to $200 trillion. And even in this world of massive financial markets, that's real money. Of course, we need to drill down a bit more and can't stop there and think about this in a more comprehensive fashion. But, you know, in the United States, as the bankers and others fight against financial reform, they've been leaning more and more heavily on this idea that we have to do a cost-benefit analysis of financial regulation. And, of course, the banking lobby, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, always talks about the costs of financial regulation, at least from their perspective. But if you understand that this financial crisis has had these massive costs in many different parts of the world, it's pretty easy to see that the cost-benefit analysis would come down pretty clearly on regulating the financial sector a lot more strictly than we have been in the past, and that it looks like we're going to in the near future. We are in this financialized capitalism at the moment that you all know about and have been writing about and studying for a while. And locked in the devastating dynamic of deregulation, financial innovation, financial crash, and then bailout. And this cycle of deregulation, boom, bust, and bailouts has also led, because of moral hazard and the underwriting of the financial sector by the government, to enormous growth in the financial sector in the US, in the UK, and indeed in many parts of the world. I'll just show you a few data figures that won't surprise you. US total financial assets as a percentage of GDP went from about 400% in 1945 to about 1,000% in 2007 on the eve of the financial crisis. Financial sector profits as a share of total profits in the US went from about 20% in 1934 to 40% just before the crisis. This is financial sector share of total profits in the US economy. And you can think about all the different things for good or ill that the US economy produces and see that 40% of the profits went to the financial sector. It's pretty stunning. In the UK, we have figures that are almost as extreme. Financial profits as a share in the UK economy up to about 30% just prior to the crisis. More broadly in Europe, we know that there are some very sizable financial institutions compared to the sizes of the economies in which their headquarters or inhabit. The far left bar actually is UBS, a bank asset to GDP ratio of 2%, 2 times, to GDP. Credit Suisse, 1.5%. Deutsche Bank right here in Germany, over 0.5, half as big as GDP. U.S. banks are actually smaller as a share of the U.S. economy. That doesn't make them any less dangerous, but they are a bit smaller. J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, et cetera, down the line a bit. Now, an additional clear cost of this massive growth in the financial sector, in my view, is the massive increase in income inequality. These are some data put together in conjunction with my colleague and former student Arjun Jayadev, where we look at rentier income, that is incomes going to financial institutions and as returns on financial assets, versus labor income from 1952 in the US to 2010. The light blue line is the rentier income, the dark blue line is the labor income. These are indices. And you can see that the rentier income levitated starting around 1980 relative to labor income. And if you look at the share of the top 1% of the income distribution on the left-hand side of this diagram, and the rentier share index on the horizontal axis down at the bottom, and put the data points in chronological connection with one another, you see that from 1952 to 1980, there was actually an inverse relationship between the share of the top 1% and the rentier share. But after 1980, as the rentier share went up, so did the share of the top income 1% of the income distribution. So there's something about the way that our financial sector has been operating, and you have similar things going on in the United Kingdom and some other countries, where a lot of the personal distribution inequality is connected with some of these functional income inequalities, and in particular, the share of income going to finance and to CEOs that are connected one way or another with finance. Now, as I suggested earlier, regulators in the US and Europe are trying to do something to try to prevent another great financial crash, try to regulate the financial sector. But bankers and politicians fight back, and they've so far been fighting back very successfully, I'm afraid. And they have a number of different arguments. Rules will harm banks and reduce their competitiveness. Banks will move abroad. Intermediation will become more expensive. They talk about a banker brain drain. They talk about stifling of financial innovation. And Jamie Dimon, who recently has been paying multi-billions of dollars to the US government because of some little mistakes that JP Morgan made, he says, "We can manage our own risk just fine, thank you." And there was a recent picture in the New York Times that I couldn't resist putting up here. This shows this Houston law firm. It was an article about how American law firms that are essentially lobbying firms have come to Brussels and are setting up shop and making lots and lots of euros, lobbying against financial regulation and other kinds of regulations. And this was a picture of our very racially diverse and gender diverse group of lobbyists, which is one of the only exports these days from the US to Europe, it seems. Well, what I say, if the financial sector is highly bloated to begin with and isn't performing many useful social functions, and we shouldn't worry too much about banks leaving, we shouldn't worry too much about banker brain drain, such as it is, we might just want to say goodbye and good riddance, which I think was the idea in some of the audience reaction to this. But I think we have to actually look more carefully at what is it that finance actually has been doing. Has this growth in the financial sector contributed positively to economic growth commensurate with its size? And one simple picture gives us a little bit of a hint. This is taken from Thomas Philippone, who's done quite a lot of good work in this area. This again is the United States, looking at 1860 to 2010. On the vertical axis is the 10-year change in the finance share. That's the share of income going to finance. And on the horizontal axis is the 10-year growth of GDP per capita. 1860, 2010, you could probably torture the data enough to give you some relationship, but if you just look at this graph, it doesn't seem like there's much of a connection at all. You can hand over a lot more share of income to finance, and it's not going to generate a lot more economic growth for you, is the message here. Indeed, there's an increasing evidence of a U-shaped relationship between the size of the financial sector and economic growth. And there are a number of very good papers being written, econometric papers on this topic. As a little bit of a plug, I urge you to go hear Simone Stern, who tomorrow is going to present a paper here, casting further doubt on this finance-growth relationship. But this literature that looks at the relationship or non-relationship between finance and growth doesn't really tell us very much about what types of financial activities are useful and what types are not. And that's what I want to look a little bit at more today as part of a broader research project I've been engaging in with colleagues and students for a while now. We need to learn a lot more about what kind of finance promotes job creation, risk reduction, retirement protection, and the financing of socially useful investment, including, of course, those devoted to addressing climate change. If you look at the literature, they tell us what the roles of finance is supposed to be. It's supposed to channel finance to productive investment, provide mechanisms to transfer income over time, help households and businesses reduce risk sharing, help provide stable and elastic liquidity, and help provide useful financial innovations. And so what we want to do is look at each of these and ask, well, has finance been doing this? And the basic message, I think, is that there are public-private roles of finance to make profit for shareholders and for the CEOs of financial firms, the people my colleague Jim Crotty called the rainmakers in these firms. I think a reasonable claim that one could argue is that finance has been doing a much better job at furthering these private roles than the social ones. So what are the estimates of the contribution to the financial sector? So let's start with channeling finance to productive investment. Now, a high share of lending in the US and the UK, and as we saw in some parts of Europe, have been to households and to property development and to support trading in financial assets. With Irene Levena, who was a graduate student at UMass and is now teaching in the UK, we looked at the finance gap, which is the difference between, it's basically a measure of external funds required by non-financial corporation, to look at how much finance is needed to finance investment. And as somebody mentioned, I think earlier today, the financing gap relative to capital expenditures in the US has actually been falling quite a bit, so that by 2000, 2009, it was, this is the far right column there, was actually negative. The financing gap in the UK similarly has been falling as a share of capital expenditures. More and more financing is being done by internal funds, less and less recourse to the external financial markets. So it doesn't appear that the banks are providing a lot of finance to non-financial corporations in the US or the UK recently. And indeed, if you look at the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Austria, in data put together by a graduate student, João Paulo de Souza at UMass, if you focus on the bottom three rows there, net lending, you'll see that the financial sectors in the Netherlands and Austria and the United Kingdom have actually been lending money to the financial sector. So this is a sign of financialization of non-financial corporations in a number of the financial centers in Europe. Now, how much income do the financial institutions get for not providing all that much external funding to the non-financial corporations? Again, with Jim Crotty and Irene Levena, we saw that the gross value added to the financial corporate business relative to the financing gap, that is how much banks get for what they deliver to non-financial corporations, the amount that they get has doubled since 1940s to 2000, from 0.4% to 0.8%. There's an increasing disconnect more generally between the financial sector and financing of productive investment. The line, if you look at this graph, you'll see the blue line is the total total assets relative to GDP. The gray line that's kind of straight at the bottom is primary financial assets relative to GDP. The dashed line is derivatives. So we see that the total initial assets to GDP is pretty much constant since '98, but the total financial assets have been going up dramatically. And we're trying to figure out what are these total increase in financial assets on the secondary market. One thing that finance has been doing is simply lending to itself for proprietary trading and taking bets. The net lending of the financial sector to itself in the UK, for example, from 1963 to 2012, went up from 5% of total lending to 40% just before the crisis. So just before the crisis, the financial sector was lending about 40% of its total lending just back to itself. And as my colleague Jane DeRista put it, the financial crash in the first instance was a run by the financial sector on the financial sector. It had been lending a lot to itself, and then that lending was called in. The United States, similar kind of story. In fact, it's hard to get these data, and indeed it's actually impossible to get these data in a straightforward way. So we have to do estimates of how much the financial sector is actually lending to itself. This is with my student Juan Montecchino, and what we have is a minimal estimate, what we call a narrow measure, an extended estimate, which is a thick line, but both went up dramatically in the build-up to the crisis. I'm not going to show you all these diagrams, but the same thing happened in many European countries as well, not all of them. Now, what is the impact of this intra-financial lending on credit growth and investment? Juan and I looked at estimated a VAR model to look at the impact of intra-financial lending on credit growth and investment in the US, 1950 to 2011. It appears to be associated with lower investment. So if you look at an impulse response function on the VAR that we estimated, the dashed lines are 95% confidence intervals. It's in quarterly data. You can see that an increase in intrafinancial assets appear to be associated with a reduction in real investment. Now, we're not sure what the channel is, but arguably it has to do with the limits on balance sheets, which lead, when the financial sectors lend towards each other, they tend not to lend as much to other firms for investment. The European banks had similar kinds of actions. Some of you might have been following the debate about what the European banks did during the financial crisis. It turns out that they were up to their eyeballs in US subprime lending. There are massive increases by European banks lending to the US in the lead up to the crisis. So we see similar kinds of activities there. I'm going to skip through some of this. Now, one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is that financial institutions in the US and elsewhere have massive increases in excess reserves held rather than lending to the real economy. And there's some debate about what function those are serving. In some ways, they appear to be simply the idea of you can't push on a string, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make the horse drink. It's an increase in liquidity preference. But there's some evidence, in fact, that what US banks are doing, and perhaps this is happening in Europe as well, is that they're using these excess reserves to then buy US Treasury securities, use those Treasury securities as collateral in the repo market to borrow further money and to speculate in all kinds of assets, commodities, equities, et cetera. So then rather than the idea that these banks are holding on to excess reserves because they just can't think of anything else to do with it, in fact what's happening is that they're using the excess reserves through various kinds of long credit chains to engage in enormous speculation. Now, some people have blamed QE2 and the similar kinds of policies here in Britain, for example, for causing this, but we know that these kinds of actions happened before QE2. Perhaps QE2 is contributing to this kind of activity, but this is just the normal operating procedure now of US and foreign banks. I'm going to skip through some of this so I can get to, how much time do I have left?
9 minutes.
9 minutes. Part of the problem that we have is that these financial institutions have adopted a new banking model in the last 15 or 20 years, that banks, in a sense, have become like hedge funds on steroids. They went from a period, and this comes from a very good economist at the OECD, Adrian Blundell-Wignall, who has written a lot of good stuff on this. We went from a period of traditional banking where banks made their money by spreads and then used monitoring to pick out good borrowers and lent the money, to capital market banking, where banks get very low spreads and get most of their money from trading, kinds of shenanigans that I was just talking about. So what is to be done? I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about what we should do about all this. And the current policy that's being promoted by the powers that be mostly focus on capital requirements. You might have seen that Alan Greenspan is going around hawking a new book, and he was on every talk show that he could possibly get on, and he says, we just didn't know what was going to happen, and nobody knew what was going to happen, and gosh, it happened. So what could we do about it? Well, he's proposing capital requirements, and I think in the end that is what most mainstream economists and financiers are also proposing. The problem with capital requirements is that they're easy to evade, especially if they're risk-based capital requirements, and it's pro-cyclical. The amount of equity you have on your balance sheet is a pro-cyclical value, so that in a boom it goes up, the bank can lend more, and through a feedback mechanism can get the bubble going even further. Leverage requirements are better because they're harder to gain, and so it's good to see that some institutions are proposing more leverage requirements. There are also better things we can do to cut down on some of the speculation: financial transactions taxes, tax surcharges or clawbacks on salaries and bonuses going to the rainmakers to try to get them to take on fewer risks and so forth. But simply reducing the size of the financial sector will have important macroeconomic benefits and would stabilize employment and so forth. Certainly for some areas, it would reduce employment. For London, for New York, for other financial centers, it would reduce employment, at least in the short run. But more generally, there's a broader question about why have governments been so susceptible to blackmail by financial sectors. And part of the reason is that we don't have an alternative good policy to generate employment in other sectors. And so we need an alternative employment policy, I think, to substitute for the very destructive role that finance has been playing. So what kind of alternative policy can we implement? Well, we need to reorient financial institutions and markets to reverse the balance of power between democratic governments and financial markets. And what I and other colleagues, Dominique Pleon and others, have proposed is what we need is more finance without financiers. That is, we need more public financial institutions and more financial institutions that act like public financial institutions. I heard a very interesting talk this afternoon, several talks about the Brazilian public financial sector and the positive role that that has been playing. And that's the kind of thing that one has in mind. Now, specifically, how can we use these kinds of institutions to promote a green transition, more sustainable employment? We can't rely just on the market to do it, but we have many tools that can be used to help use and direct the financial sector, particularly if there are public controls over the financial sector, to allocate more credit to green investments. As Tom Pally, who's sitting in the audience here, and Bob Poland and others have proposed, asset-backed reserve requirements, where banks have to hold fewer reserves on investments lent for a green transition, for green jobs. Loan guarantees, used for many purposes in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere in the post-war period, should make a revival. Directed subsidized credit for particular kinds of green investments. A well-known set of tools can be used again. Development banks, but we need to generate sustainable development banks whose mission is precisely to help generate this transition to green employment. And European Investment Bank is an example of a bank that could adopt that mission. Much work has been done by my colleagues Bob Poland, Heidi Garrett-Peltier, and James Heinz and Perry about how many jobs these kinds of investments could create. And they've compared the jobs in sustainable technology with jobs in other kinds of areas. So if you have a $1 billion investment, for example, this is in the United States, in the military it would generate 12,000 jobs, clean energy 16,000, and in spending on the oil industry, the far right column there, it's only 542,000 jobs. Now, if you, there are other sectors, of course, where a lot of jobs can be created, including in the United States. Education creates 26,000 jobs per $1 billion in spending. Now, these jobs that are created are across all kinds of levels. So they're entry-level jobs, they're high-paid jobs, they're medium-level jobs, they're jobs with job ladders. There's a whole range of jobs that could be created in this field. And these are jobs that on net balance will create significant employment. For example, $150 billion investment in the United States over the next 10 years would generate 2.3 million jobs, 2.3 million jobs in the green sector. It would only create 800,000 jobs in the oil and fossil fuel sector. So you have a net balance of 1.5 million jobs or so created. What not to do, if I have 1 minute?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Oh, I can really slow down then. What not to do is adopt a cap-and-trade solution, which is what Europe has implemented, and there's a lot of talk in the US to do as well. Because what cap-and-trade does, especially if the permits are given away, creates a secondary market in permits, and you have the financial institutions getting involved in the trading, and they're salivating at the mouth because this would generate speculation in these permits just as we have speculation in commodities and financial assets. Somebody told me, it sounded like it should be true even if it's not, that we have more lobbyists in Washington from the financial sector lobbying for cap and trade than we have lobbyists from green groups lobbying for solutions to the climate change problem. In the end, we have to help reorient economics to a reality-based economics with a real understanding of how these financial markets work. And ultimately, of course, I know in the United States, I can't speak for you all here in Europe, we have to reverse the balance of power between democratically elected governments and the financial markets. We have to get rid of all those lobbyists, you saw their picture just before, and have some more democratic control over these processes by getting money out of politics. And since this is a global problem, the financial markets are now international, we need to have a global solution. We need to have more cooperation across the Atlantic to solve these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.